They planned a quiet theft. They got a documented storm. The day I offered to buy extra groceries for my brother Mark wasn't charity. It was habit. Some people host poker night. I tally budgets and coupons at Kroger, then split the haul. Because even at 62, I can't watch him eat instant noodles and call it dinner. So when Mark texted that morning, "Can you pick up coffee?" out of cash, I nodded at my calculator and added it to the list. 2 hours later, I handed him the brown bag on his porch, smile on my face, hair still static from the produce section. He didn't open the door. The first humiliation was hearing him on the smart speaker, voice artificially bright. "Just leave it there, Jan, thanks. We're set for now." Then a second voice, his new friend Paula, chimed in giggling about how I always milk the martyr routine. My groceries set like an orphan child. When Mark finally appeared, he only poked his head out far enough to snatch the bag and close the door without looking me in the eye. I stood there debating whether to knock again when Paula's laughter grew louder behind the glass. I could see her through the curtain, her manicure glinting as she scrolled on my late mother's iPad. That was supposed to be mine when Mom went. My own brother had walked away with more than coffee this year. The final insult was delivered unceremoniously. "By the way," he called before shutting me out completely, "I'll need your signature on something for the house later. No rush." It was a cold walk back to my battered Toyota. Grocery receipt in one pocket, pride in shreds in the other. I tried to console myself. Kindness is its own reward, Judith. But every step felt like a deduction straight from my dignity account. If you think that's where family betrayal ends, you haven't met Mark on payday. 2 days after my doorstep demotion from sister to delivery mule, Mark invited me over with a cryptic voicemail. We should talk about Mom's place. The living room still smelled like her rosewater hand cream and microwave popcorn, a combination I used to find comforting. Now it felt like a mausoleum filled with ungrateful ghosts. Mark poured cheap whiskey into 2 chip tumblers and waited until we sat down before sliding a stapled packet across the coffee table. He said, as if this explained why he'd printed copies of our joint account statements and highlighted mysterious withdrawals in garish yellow. "You took out $300 last week?" he asked flatly. My mouth pressed into a line. "That was for the property tax bill, like we agreed." He shook his head slowly, stirring his ice cubes like they owed him rent money. "Paula says you shouldn't be making decisions without consulting me. She thinks you're impulsive." He glanced at me over his glasses as if measuring whether I'd throw my drink. That was new, letting Paula, the woman who nicknamed herself house manager after knowing us for 6 months, dictate family business. My sarcasm slipped out before I could stop it. "Of course Paula says so. She has such a deep understanding of our joint finances." He ignored that. "I need you to sign something so I can handle bills myself online." I braced myself. Forged signatures are Mark's specialty, but read every word. If I signed, he'd have full control over withdrawals from our joint account where Mom's insurance payout still sat cooling its heels until probate ended. "Why can't we just do this together?" I asked. Mark's jaw ticked sideways. Paula leaned against the doorframe with what she probably thought was an enigmatic smile. "Because some people don't know how to say no," Paula said sweetly, eyes on me. I set down my glass and stood up with care so nothing would break, myself included. "When you two are ready to treat me like family instead of an ATM, call me." Mark didn't follow me out, not even to return my keys. The next morning's mail brought another slab, an updated statement showing several large transfers marked simply maintenance, none approved by me, and a letter from our home insurance company requesting confirmation that ownership was changing hands. Some people cut you out with knives. Mine used paperwork. 3 weeks of silence followed, unless you count passive-aggressive texts like, "Can you grab Paula's dry cleaning?" or huffy emails about overdue utilities mysteriously attributed to me. "You agreed to handle water." I worked longer hours at the nonprofit, folding receipts into tiny squares so they wouldn't jab me like reminders each time I opened my purse. Then came Thursday. A day so humid my glasses fogged up when I stepped outside. And Mark showed up at my apartment clutching an envelope thick enough to choke a paper shredder. He began rather grandly, before adding under his breath, and as legal co-owner of Mom's house. As if reciting from cue cards Paula wrote for him after too much boxed wine, he explained that he'd need my signature immediately for refinancing purposes. When pressed, his answers were cagey. He insisted this would help us both, but danced around why Paula would be listed as secondary beneficiary on our mother's life insurance policy. Since when is Paula heir to anything except awkward dinner conversations? I deadpanned. In 3 short years, we'd gone from sharing Sunday pancakes at Mom's table to fighting over crumbs neither of us truly owned anymore. But betrayal isn't always spectacular. It can be death by 1,000 little cuts. And every cut leaves a record somewhere. If you want to know what happens when records talk back louder than brothers do, well, just keep listening. My nerves poked through every word as I phoned Mr. Klein, the sole lawyer in Dayton who tolerates family drama for less than full price and accepts homemade banana bread in lieu of late fees. Sitting across from him amid stacks of paper lads and mugs inscribed with "Trust but Verify," I slid our joint account statements over like dirty laundry. He skimmed silently until his lips pressed thin enough to make a paper cut jealous. "Do you have proof those withdrawals weren't authorized?" I nodded grimly and explained how our bank required dual consent for transfers above $500, a protocol instituted after Mom caught Mark gambling online years ago. Some habits stick harder than gum under church pews. Mr. Klein made a copy of my evidence pile and asked one question. "Did either of them know about the smart speaker in your brother's entryway?" My turn for thin lips now. If Mark knew Alexa stored conversations alongside weather reports and bad jokes, he'd have pawned it months ago. Back home, I queued up old audio files through my phone app, snippets of Mark complaining about how Judith won't notice if we move some money around, Paula advising him to just get her signature while she's tired, even one where Mark lamented being stuck waiting for probate idiots while railing about lawyers' fees. Armed with these sound bites and righteous indignation, I went straight to our family banker downtown. Small-town perks, she'd known us since Cub Scouts. She listened carefully while scanning statements on her screen. By noon, she'd frozen outgoing transfers, pending signed approval from both owners. Then came phase 2, confronting Mark at Mom's house so there'd be no confusion or denial about who said what or when. "Let's clear this up with someone impartial," I proposed evenly as he opened the door. Mark tried bluffing until I played back his own voice describing his little plan. All that bluster evaporated faster than cheap cologne in July heat. He blanched as if Alexa herself had materialized holding subpoena papers instead of grocery lists. We stood there while Paula retreated into silence, a first, as neighbors watered lawns nearby and pretended not to watch through their windows. When Mr. Klein called later that week with news of a pending investigation by state insurance regulators, apparently Paula had gotten creative with beneficiary forms. Even sarcasm failed me for once. I just laughed into my pillow till it hurt. Sometimes power shifts don't roar. They tiptoe in wearing earbuds and wielding bank apps instead of gavels. You might want to hear what happens when secrets echo all the way downtown and back again. Dayton's courthouse looks less like justice and more like someone glued together spare parts from 4 different post offices, but that Monday morning felt historic anyway. Neighbors gathered on curbs, pretending their dogs needed extra walks, just as Mark arrived flanked by a lawyer expensive enough to wear cufflinks shaped like tiny gavels. Inside, Mr. Klein shuffled papers while Mark fidgeted beside Paula, who wore sunglasses indoors. The judge listened quietly as Mr. Klein laid out a human case, not just figures or signatures, but patterns, years of petty withdrawals disguised as maintenance, insurance forms rewritten in handwriting that matched none of ours, Alexa recordings confirming whose voice had directed what transfer and whose whisper had suggested who got what share after probate ended. Paula gamely tried denial until bank records did their silent work, and then she simply stared straight ahead while Mark shriveled into his collarbones beside her lawyer.
Through glass doors, we watched as representatives from the state office finished their inquiries. By day's end, Paula was unceremoniously dropped from beneficiary lists she'd padded so elaborately, while Mark lost unilateral control over both house deed and joint account indefinitely, pending further review and some mandatory financial counseling thrown in for good measure. No dramatic bailiffs or screaming matches, just quiet lines drawn where none existed before. Sometimes Mark texts stiffly about upcoming obligations. Mostly he stays distant except for court-mandated counseling check-ins or one-word holiday greetings. Peace. Once he left a thank you note on my windshield, the handwriting shaky but real, for calling off further legal action once restitution concluded. As for Paula, last anyone saw she moved 2 towns east, where smart speakers don't remember so well, and local banks print customer photos behind every teller window, just in case trust gets misplaced again. True dignity isn't something anyone hands back after stealing. You reclaim it, bit by bit, in painted doors, honest laughter over pie, and quiet houses where your own voice is finally enough. The storm they started never did clear them off, but it swept daylight through every locked room inside me. The neighbors who'd once waved nervously now stopped by with easy familiarity. One afternoon, Mrs. Farrell arrived with tomato seedlings in a paper cup, her way of admitting she'd always thought Mark was a little too clever with numbers. I planted them in Mom's garden bed and let my hands get dirty, feeling something knotted inside me start to loosen with every scoop of soil. Mrs. Farrell sat down on the stoop, chatting about her grandson's spelling bee as if nothing had ever been tense between us. Closure, if that's what anyone calls it, arrived quietly. Sometimes I found myself waiting for Paula's sticky perfume or Mark's heavy tread in the hall. Sometimes I wanted to scold myself for missing the sound at all. The bank called just once more. Everything officially squared away, insurance payout rerouted, all signatures accounted for at last. I thanked them politely and hung up before relief turned into fresh bitterness.
In late May, Mark parked outside and waited until sunset before ringing the bell. He stood awkwardly with a manila envelope, his counseling paperwork, and a note in his careful block print. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. He didn't ask to come in, but he glanced over my shoulder at the living room as if expecting ghosts. We stood there a little too long for comfort, words stuck behind our teeth. That night, I cleaned out the last of Paula's thrift store trinkets from Mom's china hutch and boxed them up for goodwill. There was no ceremony, just a silent room and the faint hum of distant traffic, but it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. Some nights, I still dreamt of locked doors and overheard voices, but when morning came, I opened every window wide and let light spill over everything. Documented storm or not, this home was mine again. The old mailbox squeaked as I pulled open the lid, a silly sound that always made me smile. Most mornings brought nothing but real estate flyers and bills, but one gray Tuesday, an envelope stood out. My name written in ink that wobbled, uncertain. Inside was a clipped article, insurance fraud sentencing in a nearby county. No note, just underlined paragraphs and a single coffee-stained question mark in the margin. I took it inside, pinning it to the fridge as a strange sort of talisman. I started volunteering more at the library, shelving books with the weightless pleasure of someone unobserved. There were quiet exchanges with strangers over paperbacks and recipes traded on index cards folded into purses. Once or twice, I caught myself humming as I alphabetized mystery novels, no longer flinching at footsteps behind me or feeling compelled to check my phone every hour for emergencies that never came. Mark slipped further into the edges of my life. A postcard arrived from St. Louis, no return address, just a drawing of a riverboat and the words, "Learning to swim." If he wanted forgiveness, he'd have to earn it somewhere between here and wherever he landed next. The house felt honest now. No hidden paperwork under mattresses, no anxiety pressing down from the attic like stale air. Sometimes, late at night with nothing but distant train whistles for company, I'd think about how easy it is to lose sight of your own boundaries and how hard it is to win them back. But each morning brought proof I'd managed it.
Unopened mail stacked neatly on the hall table, sunflowers nodding in the window box outside, peace humming just beneath the quiet. My hands moved easily now through the morning routines, coffee percolating, curtains drawn wide for the day's first light, radio tuned low to a station that played more laughter than news. I found pleasure in the small confirmations of solitude, a favorite mug warm between my fingers, the gentle pulse of water from an unshared faucet. Rain came and went, soaking the garden and misting the porch, but inside everything stayed orderly, untroubled. That November, a neighbor's daughter knocked to collect for her school fundraiser. I invited her in and let her pick a cookie from the jar while she explained her goal in confident bursts. Her mother stood on the walk, waving shyly through the glass. I called out for her to come in too. Before I knew it, we were huddled around the kitchen table, sharing stories about old Dayton winters, snowdrifts, stuck cars, the year the power flickered for days. For once, my mother's house felt like a gathering press instead of a fortress. In quiet hours, I sorted through boxes in the attic, memory bins marked by Mom's handwriting and others that bore my clumsier scrawl. There were letters I'd written but never sent, photographs of Mark with that familiar wry smile before either of us knew grown-up resentments. I kept some, tucked others away, and burned a few in the fire pit out back under a sky streaked violet. Watching the paper curl and fade, I felt sorrow and gratitude twisted together like old roots. Thanksgiving was approaching when Mark's name flashed on my phone again. This time, his voice was softer, practiced but thinner at the edges, asking if he could stop by just to talk. I hesitated with each heartbeat, then agreed, setting boundaries with the calm of someone who'd rebuilt every wall herself. By sunset, he stood on my porch, hands empty save for an apology he didn't quite know how to give. We sat side by side, feet brushing damp leaves, letting silence fill gaps years in the making. Dignity doesn't require forgiveness. It only asks that you honor what you've learned. As darkness settled around us, and neither of us reached for old wounds, I understood. I was free and home at last. The porch swing creaked gently as we sat, the hush between us broken only by an occasional car passing down the street. Mark gazed at the yard, tracing the outline of Mom's garden beds with his foot, careful not to meet my eyes. I waited, hands folded, letting him feel the weight of honesty for once in his life. He cleared his throat, but words came out slowly, jumbled as the leaves swirling at our feet. "I keep thinking about how we ended up here," he said, finally, his voice rough. "I thought winning meant getting the house or the money. Now I see I lost more than I ever gained." Moonlight softened him, gave a fleeting glimpse of the kid who once shared comic books with me under a blanket fort. I didn't answer right away. There was no tidy way to package forgiveness, no single declaration to resolve years of bruised trust. Instead, I offered him a blanket against the chill and asked how he was sleeping. He blinked in surprise at the ordinary kindness, proof that dignity, once reclaimed, could be extended with conditions. The conversation wandered from weather to childhood birthdays to stories about Mom's old friends, now mostly gone or forgetful themselves. We laughed, real laughter, punctured by awkward pauses, but genuine. And when he left hours later, he hugged me goodbye for the first time in decades. There were no promises, just two siblings accepting the hard-won quiet for what it was. Inside, I made tea and stood by the window as his taillights disappeared around the corner. The air in the house felt new somehow. No ghosts clamoring behind doors, no eyes on my every step. I turned off lights one by one and went to bed with the absolute certainty of someone who had survived her own storm and come through clean on the other side. In the hush that followed, mornings arrived with a softer edge. I found myself humming as I folded laundry,
grateful for the quiet tasks that now belonged only to me. There was a difference to solitude, no longer edged with suspicion or fatigue, just a certain peace that filled the corners of each room. The shadows in the hallway belonged to early sunlight instead of doubts. I invited the neighbor's daughter back to help decorate for the holidays. We strung paper snowflakes across the mantel and baked gingerbread, her laughter bouncing off the walls in a way I realized I'd missed for years. The kitchen was full of warmth and spice, every surface dusted with flour and hope. Later, standing by the front window, I watched the first flakes of snow gather along the fence line, thinking how silence could be a kindness after all. Mail came less frequently now. No more surprises or legal envelopes, just an occasional card or coupon. I wrote letters to old friends on creamy paper and bought new stamps at the corner store, enjoying the deliberate slowness of pen on page. My days found their own rhythm: early coffee, long walks at Carillon Park, evenings with a book and the radio murmuring low. On one particularly cold night, Mark left a basket of apples and a loaf of bread on my porch. No note this time. He didn't need one. I placed them on my counter and made cinnamon toast, savoring each bite as proof that grace can arrive in small, unexpected gestures. When I turned in, I paused at Mom's old music box on my dresser. I wound it once, letting its quiet tune fill the room, a melody that once signaled comfort in chaos and now meant only this: I was safe, at home, and finally at rest. Morning light slipped through lace curtains, dappling the hallway in soft gold. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of chamomile, the radio low as a memory, listening to birds argue in the maple beyond the window. A sense of ordinary happiness crept in around the edges, a kind of ease untouched by calculation or compromise. It surprised me how quickly life righted itself once old debts, spoken and unspoken, stopped knocking at the door. A gentle knock startled me out of thought. It was Mrs. Farrell with a tin of sugar cookies and an invitation to her annual card party. "It's nothing fancy, Judith, just neighbors and bridge." I hugged her on impulse, grateful for her stubborn kindness and the way she treated friendship like a perennial pansy. That night, the house glowed, warm with lamplight and small joys I'd nearly forgotten how to claim. I found myself reaching for things I used to love, patching up a quilt by hand, reading mystery novels late into the night, letting silence settle between chapters. Some evenings, I called old friends and we reminisced about Dayton as it used to be: picnics at the reservoir, fireworks echoing across empty fields, parents' voices calling us home as dusk fell. Now and then, Mark sent postcards from new places: a mountain town out west, a lakeside cottage further north. His notes were brief but honest, each one a small olive branch. I pinned them up beside family photographs in the hallway, reminders that memory and forgiveness can sometimes coexist without tangling. Some afternoons, I walked over to the library, not to shelve books, but to sit by the wide windows and listen to the hum of other people's lives. Mrs. Farrell would wave from her place behind the circulation desk, sliding me a dog-eared copy of something new before I could protest. "You look lighter," she'd say with a wink, "like someone who finally tossed out the dead plants." Sometimes we'd share gossip about who was secretly dating whom or which councilman had been caught napping during a meeting. Sometimes we'd just share a quiet smile over matching thermoses of tea. I started small projects around the house, painting the guest room a pale blue, patching the back fence with wood I scavenged from Mr. Becker's scrap pile. The work steadied me. Hammering nails or tracing clean lines with a wet brush became a new kind of meditation. When I finished a wall or set an old hinge straight again, I'd step back and marvel at my own handiwork, proud of what I could claim as mine alone. On weekends, I walked to Carillon Park for farmers market mornings, filling my basket with whatever looked freshest: early peas, strawberries glowing like treasure, bread so warm it steamed up my glasses. There were familiar faces everywhere: Janet selling honey, Tom handing out samples of cheese from his dairy stand. Each exchange was small but meaningful. "How are you today?" "Glad it's not raining." A gentle reassurance that community could be built from these everyday stitches of kindness. Sometimes Mark would call after dinner when he knew it was safe, when darkness made confessions easier to voice. One night he admitted he'd started seeing a counselor for anger stuff, as he put it sheepishly. "Turns out you can't buy your way out of your own mess," he said with a dry chuckle. My reply was gentle but honest. "You can't spreadsheet your way out either." We both laughed, a sound that felt less like an apology and more like acceptance. Letters came in 2s and 3s from cousins out east who'd heard rumors about our dust-up but wanted only recipes and news about Dayton's ever-changing weather. I answered each one at my kitchen table, careful to keep my words bright but true. "We're doing well now, making peace in our own slow way." Sometimes I'd tuck in pressed flowers from Mom's garden or a photo of a pie cooling on my windowsill. With each passing month, I noticed how even my body changed. Shoulders uncoiling from their perpetual stoop, jaw unclenched at last. At night, I slept deeply beneath Mom's patched quilt, comforted by its familiar weight and the knowledge that nothing waited in the dark but tomorrow's gentle obligations. One Saturday morning, a knock startled me mid-pancake flip. Mark stood on the porch holding 2 mugs from our childhood cupboard, one chipped, one missing its handle entirely, and a small bag of donuts dusted with cinnamon sugar. He looked younger than his years for once, uncertain but hopeful. "Mind if we eat on the steps?" he asked, and I nodded him in with a smile. We sat side by side watching sparrows peck at crumbs and talked about everything but money. How Dad used to burn toast every Sunday. How we once built sandcastles so elaborate the neighbor boys paid us to design theirs. How Mom sang off key while she vacuumed every Saturday morning. For those brief hours, we were siblings again. Not adversaries or co-claimants, but 2 people sharing memory and sunlight. After he left that afternoon, I realized forgiveness hadn't required any grand gestures, just time enough for old hurts to dull, space enough for gratitude to take root where suspicion had grown wild. Later that week, I repainted Mom's front door sunflower yellow and watched as people slowed down just to admire it. Someone left a bouquet of daisies on my doorstep with a card signed only, "Welcome home." For days afterward, every time I stepped onto the porch, I felt surrounded by invisible hands steadying me, a community quietly rooting for my return to myself. The smart speaker stayed unplugged in its drawer, save for one brief encore, a young friend's son desperate to hear silly jokes while his mother made dinner in my kitchen. Its voice made us laugh until our sides hurt. Then we powered it down again for bed, grateful for both technology's memory and its mercy. One Sunday afternoon, thunder rolled over Dayton. Mark called from his car outside a lake somewhere north. He wanted advice about whether he should visit Aunt Shirley or just send flowers this year. His voice was softer now without all that clutter behind it. Mine matched his tone easily as we debated whose potato salad recipe actually tasted better. We both knew Shirley's was. These days, silence held no accusation. It simply signaled rest between kindnesses. A lull that let me hear backyard crickets or distant bells from St. Anne's without bracing for bad news. Sometimes new neighbors asked about Mom. Was she the one who gave out caramel apples at Halloween? And I'd nod fondly before showing them where she'd planted lilies along the fence line. We'd linger by her garden after sunset, trading stories about stubborn perennials and stubborn families until porch lights flickered on up and down the block.
In rare moments alone on stormy nights, I'd walk through each room touching doorknobs lightly, as if reassuring myself they were finally locked against intrusion, not just by Mark or Paula or paperwork, but by every invisible thing that ever tried to take root where peace ought to grow. The house held fewer secrets now. Even its creaks seemed friendlier. On Thanksgiving morning, Mark joined me for coffee in the kitchen sunlight, just as we both remembered Mom used to do. No ceremony, except 2 spoons clinking gently against ceramic mugs and an unexpected comfort in our easy silence. We ate cinnamon toast together without needing to fill every space with conversation. Forgiveness lived somewhere between bites now. My life did not become extraordinary. It simply became mine again, filled with quiet justice served where it mattered most, over pie shared among friends, painted doors thrown open at last, boundaries honored not as barricades, but as invitations carefully handled by those willing to knock gently first. And when evening fell soft over Dayton, the house humming with contentment, I knew this was always what home was meant to feel like. Earned peace after chaos, dignity restored stroke by stroke beneath forgiving hands, sunlight finding its way back through every window still standing strong. On Saturdays, I wandered downtown, weaving through the booths at the flea market, running my hands over old glass bottles and faded postcards. Sometimes I'd see a face I recognized from years past, a teacher, a church friend, someone who had once carried a casserole through my mother's front door. They always asked how I was, and I found myself answering honestly. Getting better now, or it's quieter these days. The words tasted right, simple and unadorned. Back at home, I tackled half-finished projects Mom had left behind. Across its sampler reading, "Bless this mess," a battered recipe box with her careful script on curling cards. I made her apple crisp and burned the first batch, then tried again until the scent finally matched memory. Some evenings I sat on the porch with my knitting, the click of needles mixing with cicada song and distant laughter from children playing tag under the streetlights.
Neighbors drifted in and out with offerings, extra soup, cuttings from their gardens, the latest neighborhood news. In return, I brought over cookies or a shoulder to lean on when Mrs. Farrell's hips started acting up. We played cards at our kitchen table, her stories looping back to childhood summers along the river, her hands quick with shuffling even when they trembled with age. One snowy afternoon, he showed up unannounced with a pie from his new favorite diner, a little lopsided but smelling of butter and cinnamon. Traded my last winning scratch-off for it, he joked as he set it down. We ate slices by the window while watching snow pile high along the curb. No talk of insurance or deeds, just sharing warmth that didn't have to be earned. During those long evenings alone, sometimes I'd reach for Mom's old photo albums. Snapshots of family reunions and park shelters, big grins caught mid-bite over barbecue chicken and potato salad. There weren't many pictures of just Mark and me as adults. Most were group shots or blurry candids. But there was one tucked behind a wedding invitation. Young Mark holding my hand after I broke my arm falling from the backyard swing set. We were grinning like fools, me with a crooked cast, him with leaves stuck in his hair. I started journaling again at night before bed. It felt different this time, less like keeping score and more like making sense of what came next in my own handwriting. Lists for groceries became lists for life. Things I wanted to try, rowing on the river. Things I'd forgiven, myself first. Things that could wait until tomorrow. Almost everything. Mrs. Farrell's card party arrived in a flurry of pastel dresses and shuffling laughter. We played bridge into the evening while someone's lemon bars cooled on the sill. When my partner trounced me by 3 tricks, she squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "We don't have to win every time." Later, as people trickled home with leftovers wrapped in foil, she pressed an extra piece into my palm. "For tomorrow," she said. With warmer weather came neighborhood gatherings. Grilling in driveways, sprinklers arcing over lawns while dogs barked at nothing in particular. More than once, someone offered to repaint my shutters or help with heavy lifting. Each time I accepted gratefully, but insisted we trade favors evenly. "I'll bake pie for labor," I bartered gleefully. Mark mailed me a guidebook to local trails after he heard I was walking further these days. He circled best view pages in blue pen and left dry commentary in margins. "Avoid this one after rain. Remember your ankle."
We joked about hiking together someday if he ever tired of city life up north. Sometimes on sleepless nights when thunder rolled far off, I'd sit by a window and watch storm clouds shift over rooftops, reminded that even tempests had their place if you waited them out long enough. One day at the library, an old friend pressed a yellowed envelope into my hand. Inside was a faded letter from Mom she'd found tucked inside a recipe book at her own house. A half-finished note about garden plans and gratitude for how well Judith holds things together. The words made me cry quietly into my sleeve until Mrs. Farrell appeared at my side with tissues and silent understanding. That week, Mark sent another postcard, a photo of Lake Erie hemming gray rocks under an enormous sky. On the back, he scrawled, "Still learning to swim." Instead of sadness, it brought me peace. Distance no longer felt punitive, but restorative for both of us. I hosting neighbors for iced tea on muggy afternoons, passing around photo albums and stories, as if they might anchor us all through whatever came next. Someone always brought cake or homemade pickles. Someone always lingered last to help stack plates or shoo away flies from ripe peaches on the counter. One late evening, as lightning flickered beyond downtown skyline, Mark called me just to say goodnight, a habit neither of us could have imagined months before. His voice was scratchy but steady. He said, "Sleep well." This time it sounded like hope instead of obligation. After dinner, Mark lingered long after dishes were washed and dried. We sat out back under string lights strung between fence posts where sweet pea still reached skyward despite cooler nights. He handed me an envelope but didn't say what was inside until he left, a check returning what he'd taken plus interest scribbled for overdue groceries and grace. My hands shook reading it, but not from anger anymore, just relief threaded through pride. And so, on chilly nights after everyone else had gone home and porch lights flickered off one by one down our block, I'd sit alone beneath those same string lights, rereading Mom's faded notes tucked into recipe boxes, the handwriting looping steady beneath years yet untouched by bitterness or regret. And no, there was nothing left here but dignity reclaimed, word by quiet word. The storm they planned never washed me away. It scoured everything false until only what mattered most remained shining stubbornly beneath an honest sun. On the 4th of July, I hosted lemonade on the porch while neighbors gathered along Sumner Street for the parade, tractors and convertibles trailing kids with sticky fingers and plastic flags. Mark called halfway through, his voice grainy with static and laughter. "I'm grilling for a crowd and trying not to burn the burgers." I could hear music and clatter behind him. Real life, not some hollow apology. "Don't forget to toast the buns," I told him, smiling as I watched fireflies flicker across my lawn. The kitchen became a place for invention again, not just reheating or rationing leftovers. I kneaded bread on Sunday afternoons, flour dusting my hair and nose. Sometimes I tried Mom's recipes. Her chicken pot pie always took 2 attempts before the crust would behave. But more often, I made it my own. Roasted vegetables with thyme from the window box, a bright salad tossed with lemon. When I invited neighbors to taste test, they left compliments scribbled on napkins tucked into my recipe drawer. One Saturday after market, Janet the honey lady stopped by with a jar so golden it glowed in the sun. She stayed for tea at my kitchen table, tracing her finger around the rim of her mug. "You know," she said quietly, "a lot of us thought you'd disappear after everything." I shrugged and offered her another scone. Turns out I'm too stubborn. The church bazaar brought another wave of nostalgia and neighborly affection. The sanctuary was hung with paper lanterns and garlands of garden herbs. Rows of pies cooled on folding tables, while kids darted between rows of donated books and toys. Mrs. Farrell pressed me into service at the bake sale booth beside her lemon squares. "No one frosts brownies like you do," she assured. Mark even sent a donation from afar, a quilt top sewn in lopsided squares that made everyone laugh when they unfolded it.
We ate lunch at the picnic table in silence, broken only by wind shuffling leaves across the yard. For dessert, he brought cider donuts, wrapped in wax paper, the same kind we'd eaten after raking leaves as kids. Small tokens of what we'd managed to salvage after so much wreckage. "Remember when we built that snow fort so big Dad had to crawl through it?" he asked, suddenly mouthful of cinnamon sugar. "And you got stuck," I replied dryly. He grinned, crooked but honest, and let the moment hang between us before gathering his tools for home. When cold weather arrived in earnest, neighbors dropped off soup and fresh bread just because. My house filled with their voices on weekends, card games at the table, laughter echoing down halls that once seemed too empty to bear. Early December brought carolers bundled in mismatched hats singing off-key under my window,
while Mrs. Farrell's granddaughter shyly handed me a homemade ornament, a heart stitched with blue thread and a single button from her mother's old coat. Snow covered every blemish in town with its soft hush. Even old grievances seemed muffled beneath drifts piled on porch rails. I started reading aloud at library storytime again, children folded cross-legged at my feet while book pages turned slowly under their rapt stares. There was comfort in their trust, magic in how quickly news stories could overwrite painful ones. Ephemeral as all these moments might be, each one stitched something lasting inside me. Dignity reclaimed not by fighting, but by outlasting betrayal until only kindness remained. At Mrs. Farrell's last card party before she moves closer to her daughter, we play rummy with wild rules and eat too much lemon icebox pie. Laughter fills every corner. When she hugs me goodbye at her door, she whispers, "You always were tougher than you looked." The compliment feels like an heirloom pressed into my palm. On a blustery morning years later, Mark arrives unannounced, carrying nothing but 2 mugs of coffee and an awkward smile that needs no introduction anymore. We sit by the window watching rain blur our reflections in the glass. 2 siblings taking shelter together, without fear or calculation. These are not victories anyone pins to a wall or notarizes downtown. They are quieter than that. Small acts of decency undeterred by storms past or present. In every forgiving sunrise over Dayton's rooftops, I find proof. They tried to steal what mattered most quietly. Instead, they taught me how to keep it, loudly enough for myself at last. I found comfort in bustle and warmth, kneading dough for cinnamon rolls as the kitchen filled with the scent of brown sugar, or standing at my window, hot mug in hand, as snow softened the familiar world outside. On Sundays, I'd host neighbors after church for thick slices of bread and stories about days when downtown was all neon diners and shoe stores. Sometimes, Mrs. Farrell would bring her crocheting and settle in at the table, her needled hands moving faster than her voice. "Your mother would have loved this," she said one gray afternoon as we watched cardinals hop along the fence. She pressed a finished scarf into my hands. "It's too bright for me now. You wear it." I wrapped it twice around my neck, grateful for its improbable cheer. Night after night, I read dog-eared Agatha Christie mysteries beneath quilts patched with old shirts and aprons. The quiet no longer threatened, it consoled. When I couldn't sleep, I'd wander room to room with bare feet on cool boards, straightening picture frames or humming old lullabies. On rainy afternoons, children clustered on my porch for story time. I brewed cocoa on the stove while they sprawled out with coloring books or played dominoes on the rug. Their laughter tangled with thunder as if nothing could ever go wrong in the world beyond that room. Sometimes, Mark called just to swap weather complaints or compare recipes gone awry. His attempt at lemon bars had apparently ended in disaster. "Getting better at saying sorry these days," he joked once, then quieter, "Thanks for letting me try." Our words grew easy again, not quite like childhood, but as close as grown siblings get after surviving a war neither wanted. The annual Dayton Festival arrived with food trucks and marching bands. I volunteered at the pie booth with Mrs. Farrell's granddaughter, while Mark sent photos from up north, giant blueberry pies and street musicians by a muddy riverbank. Between slices of cherry pie and the sticky shuffle of tickets in my apron pocket, I found myself telling old tales to strangers who lingered just for the pleasure of being known. He handed me a plain envelope. Inside was a check for what he'd owed from our mother's estate, plus a scribbled note, "For what you carried." He looked away while I read it, but didn't flinch when I reached over to pat his hand. "Don't spend it all on groceries," he said with a crooked smile. "I might buy lemons just to spite you," I shot back. That evening, we dusted off Mom's old dominoes and played until lightning bugs lit up the yard, and our laughter startled passing dogs. When September brought cool mornings, I painted the front door again, a bold teal this time, and left it open while baking bread so the neighborhood could smell home drifting through every breeze. Neighbors stopped by more often, some for advice on taxes or insurance forms. Old habits die hard. Others just wanting to talk about nothing important at all. The holidays returned without dread this time. A crowd squeezed into my living room for cocoa and carols. After everyone left, Mark washed dishes without being asked. We fell into companionable silence, punctuated by clinks of china and occasional choruses of, "Remember when?"
One very cold morning before dawn, I woke before sunrise and realized I felt truly safe for the first time since all those betrayals began. No more waiting for footsteps or for kindness to be turned against me. The house breathed quietly around me, as if content with its own second chance. On an April morning, bright with birdsong, I watched neighbors plant tulips along their fences. Later that day, Mrs. Farrell's granddaughter knocked shyly on my door, holding out a tray of snickerdoodles she'd baked herself. "Grandma says yours are better, but mine are fresher." We sat together in the garden, swapping stories. She asked about my mother's favorite color, cornflower blue, then left with a handful of lily bulbs tucked into her coat pocket. What they tried to take quietly became my storm, and in surviving it, I found not just justice, but genuine belonging under my own roof at last. Sometimes, when I trimmed the hedges or painted the fence, neighbors would pause during afternoon walks just to chat. We traded recipes and weather predictions, and no one seemed in a hurry anymore. Janet waved from across the street, arms full of wildflowers she pressed into my hands for the dining table. "You keep this block livelier than anyone," she teased, and I just shrugged, pride warming me all the way through. The library's story hour became my favorite ritual. Children sprawled over bean bags while I read aloud, voices rising and falling like old lullabies. Afterward, parents lingered in the stacks, sharing updates about jobs and families. The librarians always saved me a seat by the window, where sunlight slanted across my open book and made everything feel possible again. One weekend, Mark called from a lakeside cabin where he'd found work managing a small shop. His voice sounded steadier, lighter even, as he talked about chopping wood or learning to cook over an open fire. "You'd hate it," he said, laughing softly. "No spreadsheets, no smart speakers telling me how to boil water." I laughed too, relieved that our conversations had become about normal life instead of what we'd lost. Mark visited at Thanksgiving, bringing a store-bought pumpkin pie with only a little apology in his eyes. We set 2 plates at Mom's old table. Conversation moved easily from football to family memories. Him burning toast as a teen, me hoarding butterscotch chips for secret cookies, both of us sneaking peeks at presents before Christmas Eve. That evening, after dinner, Mark found Mom's old radio in a box beneath the stairs. He fiddled with the dial until static gave way to big band music. We danced in slow circles on creaky floors, no steps remembered, just movement for the sake of moving, and laughed until tears ran down our faces. Children returned for story time, bundled in scarves and mittens, their cheeks ruddy from snowball fights before settling into bean bags near the radiator. "Tell us the dragon story again," they begged, so I obliged, adding new twists each time until even Mrs. Farrell declared she wanted to know how it ended. When Mrs. Farrell moved away to be closer to her daughter, we threw her a farewell party with all her favorite foods: egg salad sandwiches with too much paprika, lemonade sweet enough to pucker your lips, lemon bars that never quite set right, but no one minded anyway. Before she left, she pressed a crocheted afghan into my arms, heavy as memory itself, and whispered, "You were always braver than you thought." Mark sent postcards from various towns, each short message proof he was building his own new rituals far from Dayton, but not from family ties entirely severed. Trying ice fishing, results questionable. Saw someone who looked like Dad at the diner this morning. Wasn't him. Next trip home, I owe you apple cider. I pinned these notes on my refrigerator beside school art projects and holiday cards. One bright afternoon in May, I sat on my porch swing watching Mrs. Farrell's granddaughter sketching tulips along the sidewalk with colored chalks. Her laughter rang out as she showed me her masterpiece,
a garden blooming even brighter than the real thing behind us. On stormy evenings when thunder shook window panes, I'd reach for Mom's old music box atop my dresser and wind it gently until its song filled every room, a melody not just for comfort, but for endurance, proof that kindness endures long after storms have passed. This was what they could never steal, not dignity restored on paper, but laughter echoing late into night, not justice measured in courtrooms, but in friendships rebuilt over pie and porch lights glowing soft above every newly planted bulb along Sumner Street.